First things first, I do want to invite Manik to our group and have, if you would introduce yourself just a little bit about, I've never let someone into a workshop in the middle like this, but I talked to Manik or I Zoomed with Manik yesterday and it seemed like a good fit that would benefit. And so I think I had the feeling, I was trusting my synchronicity sense, that this would be a good thing for everybody. And so I'm happy to have you here, Manik, and I was hoping that you might just say a little bit about yourself, what you do, why you wanted to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for letting me in a little bit ways in. I heard Sean talk last week on Clubhouse on his wisdom group, because I think we have groups in common with the integralists. And then I liked what I was hearing, but I also saw that you mentioned the workshop twice, and I'm kind of in a process of transition, both professionally and personally. So it felt like I've been struggling with realizing I was in a transition professionally and not knowing how to unpack everything that was changing. And this sounded like the kind of writing practice and group practice that I could help. And I know a little bit about designing your life. I have all the books, I just can't do it on my own. So all that. So this sounded perfect. And I am, so the transition is that I am getting more and more into my digital art practice, and I make interactive digital art experiences, for a better word of it, basically things you can touch and play with, or touch with your mouse and play with, and usually musical and film and popular culture based. But I'm interested in integral theory, and I've been with the integral theory groups, a group for a year of the pandemic, and I really like the way they kind of look at modern life and integrating all our many different perspectives and trying to find common ground where no one's really wrong, and not in a like abusive way, but more like trying to find that middle space for becoming what we are in these new communities and in societies and economies. So yeah, so my art's a little bit mixed in that, and the research part is very much kind of, yeah, so I'm kind of a researcher, and then I create things out of it. So yeah, that's who I am. And I am based in Canada. I'm Canadian, but I've been American at heart for a really long time. I know that because I can never get upset about politics about anywhere else except in the US. So I've been having a bit of an aneurysm for 4 years till Trump got out. I studied in the States in Portland, and lived in New York, and then moved around the world, and I'm here now, close to the US because my family was in the US. So.
I want to turn it over to Lu Yi, who I saw you smiling, and I put it interactive digital art experiences, which was another point of connection where I'm like, okay, yeah, this would probably be an interesting connection. Do you want to share what you're doing again, Lu Yi?
Hey, yeah, so I, in my job right now, or the company I work at, we create digital interactive experiences in the cultural sector, so museums and science centers. But I'm also finding myself in like a career like transition point. So yeah. It's cool to see somebody else in that space.
So that's that's what I started out a few years ago wanting to make things for, was kind of the cultural sector, because Toronto actually has a very cool cultural sector. It's not the warmest one, but they have it. So it's cool. But yeah, it's very nice to meet someone else from the sector actually working in it. So that's really cool.
So I want to use this as like a metaphor to actually jump off what we're doing this week and around designing interactive experiences and this act of being in a museum. Like, if you're a museum curator, right, you're choosing what goes on the wall. If you are a museum curator that's designing cultural installations, you're choosing what kinds of experiences you want your viewers to have, right? And ideally, it's going to walk them through this kind of experience where they're going to be richer on the other end of it, or they will have thought about something on the other end of it, or they will basically have had an experience that is enriching, edifying, perspective giving, right? This is like the perfect metaphor for what I think we need to do for ourselves. And that is the hope for ourselves as well. So it's like, remember we talked about last week, it's almost like we're creating a map and laying out the landscape of that map, or like we're kind of like filling that in. And then there's this joke, the map is not the terrain, right? Like you're just, but this is another way of looking at, now we're looking at the interactivity of the map and how we might begin to like play in the fountain that we've discovered, or set up a museum or set up an experience to curate the bounds of an experience that might tell us something. So I wonder if I set up this archery range and fired some arrows, what that would tell me about presence. Well, it's a weird example, but I'm intentionally just choosing something randomly because literally. So when we look at the bounds of experience, one of the things we're looking at here I'm going to introduce the idea of time and kind of this exploration around what that might be. In the short term, like how might I design my day? And this is kind of what this loops back to the very first and second week where we were looking at like how we can use a daily design and contract so we can like hold ourselves to different goals, is a little mode of this. Now we're also going to start looking at other kinds of experiences we might have. So before we go any further with this, does anybody want to share anything synchronistically? Because we're basically going to take the synchronistic experiences and see if we can move them into this experimental, curatorial kind of realm. We're beginning to play with the whole idea of life design here. Whoops. Oh, life design. And if we want, I mean, we could do our free writing too, but does anyone want to share? Anybody like, ooh, synchronistic experience, I want to share this.
Okay, I'll go. I was thinking of it, but I feel like, okay, I'll just say it. So I've been thinking of this friend of mine who randomly, like 4 years back, had said that, you know what, I see you totally quitting your corporate job and trying to go search for yourself in like about 10 to 12 years because you'd realize it's not meant for you're not as left brain as you think you are. And I felt like I rejected that ideology then. And I've been thinking about that conversation randomly a lot. And suddenly I get this message. And then I had a 10-hour long phone call with him through an entire night. And that literally ended. I got the call and it was 10:00:00. And I felt like that was so meta in terms of, everything. And it made me just remember so much. And I feel like, the free writing practice and synchronicity, I feel like it's also the act of remembering that sort of manifests whatever we do. So it's not just the invitation, the whole law of attraction, but also just the act of pulling something out from that mind's well, which may indicate to the universe that it wishes to exist. And the second thing was with the last part of the email from last time where it had that levels of consciousness. And I didn't realize, but like unconsciously, I believed in that, like that whole structure of not just it existing through a lifetime and different, I guess, abstractions of life, so your work life, play life, and just life in general, but also in like a day or in a month or in cycles of being, from all the way from the whole shame to, and I felt like that was so true. The whole, sorry, Sean, you were saying.
No, I'm just going, yeah, on the cycles. I'm going, yeah, on cycle word. because that's going to come up.
Yeah, and with that whole ladder, I felt like while it's a ladder, you have to keep, it's like a never-ending ladder. So you climb on top, but then you're like snakes and ladders, you just get pushed back down into different parts of that space, and you have to keep remembering that, you know, I'm over this, I'm over the shame, I'm over the guilt, and I'm over the anger. And sometimes you need to stay there and sit there and let it marinate within you so it chooses to leave of its own and then climb somewhere else. That's all. Done.
My name is Sabarna, and I'm done speaking.
Yeah.
To use the Clubhouse thing. Yeah, two things I wanted to really highlight. One, you use the word conversation, which is what we're really, I think that's amazing. And the whole idea of memorying, I put in my personal notebook, the act of remembering is what manifests, which is really interesting. You also said to draw, pulling something from the mind's well. If you look at all this experience that we have, and we're starting to actually make meaning and significance out of it, and then all of a sudden we're remembering something or reconnecting with something, that's really, really interesting. If we look at, so traditional learning, we start here, we end here, and we're going to get to this outcome. The integral, or more like, I don't know, I wanted to say the word spiritual, but I'm not sure that that really is appropriate. It's like looping. It's recursive, right? We're like looping, and I wanted to get this. This is from Ray Dalio's Principles book, but it's like if you put this in a spiral, so we're like kind of looping around and coming back. So there's like this is very intentionally chosen in how he kind of goes into this whole really dissection of goal setting, where you have like audacious goals, you have goals, and then you kind of, you just see like there's that loop, right? And he's basically saying we have these audacious goals, we fail, we learn, we improve, and then we set new goals. So that he has this downward like failing, things not working as part of this looping section, which I don't know that I necessarily, you need to assign those words to it, but just that idea of looping and coming back is one way to look at memory, which is another way to look at real, actually authentic growth. Might also be interesting, I thought of, in Buddhism, in the cognitive sequence, there's actually, you can break down a moment into 17 different sections. So every moment has 17 different parts to it. And enlightenment actually happens at the moment of recall. So it's in recalling what happened that somebody is liberated. It's at the end of the cognitive sequence.
So it is pulling from the eternal memory
of that moment. If we're my advisor did some his dissertation on the cognitive sequence, which is like it's anyway. Yes, manic.
Did you mean that it's like enlightenment happens at the realization of those 17 moments as a recall?
One of the 17 moments, you're recalling what happened in one of those 17 moments. So there's like insight that's maintained. And then in that, when you recall that insight, my teacher said that like when you recall that insight happened, when you're basically like, I had that glimpse, when there is like a remembering of what just happened and a recall, that is when enlightenment happens, supposedly. And I would need to relook into the cognitive sequence stuff. I just thought that might be a little too esoteric. But
I had no idea of that level of detail. I was just trying to understand it because it's kind of interesting to think of 17 moments in a moment.
Those early Buddhists really got the mind down. They really looked at it, I think.
They had so many less distractions than we did.
Brad would call them shiny objects.
Yes. I was going to say what you said about the spiritual. I mean, I think there's this whole, I think there's this fear of the word spiritual. And this came up in your call too. I absolutely hate people saying anything is woo-woo just because it isn't woo-woo. Like the spiritual is anything that we could be, like relying on outside our logical kind of sense mind. Like it could be just the gardening you do, or the time you know, walk and have time in nature, or it can be religious, or it can be actually like something more of the meditative and energy arts. But I feel like that's, so I am not an expert in integral theory, but I'm part of Jeremy Johnson's Gebser group, and that's how my most exposure to integrals. And so in Jean Gebser's ever-present, this concept of the ever-present origin is like that loop. Like we are always, at some point, always tapping into something that is at the core of our existence, which probably syncs with what Buddhism says too, is that there is this ever-present factors or elements in our life that have been there through history, through, you know, humanity's existence, and they come back in looping circles. Like the parts of the past that are, you know, always there and coming back. So yes, that's it. Just when you sort of that loop, when you're talking about that, I just thought of that, because that spirituality, Jean Gebser was talking about spirituality in that sense, because of things being there and our recognition, even if it is the way you feel around a tree, you know, when you connect deeply to a tree or a park or something, it's all part of that ever-present, like that part of
deep
our mind
memory
that remembers so much of more than just what we know today as modern life, right? Like that's how I understood from so much of what people talk about Gebser's work. Yeah, that's all I had to say.
So, wow, yeah, okay. Do we get the sense that we're almost like revisiting terrain, but in a different way? What's that famous quote? So this is what it's like to arrive at where we've always been, but to somehow, like, you know what I'm saying? There's that cheesy quote, but somehow like see it with fresh eyes or something. Like we actually return to where we've always been. Which fits into the unlearning phrase on the first week, right? Instead of, we're not trying to necessarily get somewhere to live the good life, maybe. We're just trying to see where we already are with more clarity, presence, loving kindness, equanimity, sympathetic joy. You choose it. I also put in the chat Louis' mystery meter as like a good way from last time. I love that, about just like increasing more mystery to increase these other things.
And I think I sorry, but on Louis' mystery meeting, I have to compliment that, because I thought about it almost every other day in terms of just like the whole work and play dynamics. And every time I was becoming so constrained, I'm like, no, this is not a part of my routine. I'm like, where's your mystery meter? Why aren't you being receptive to it? Why can't you have to let it in? You have to invite it in. And I feel like that word or that visual of a mystery meter sort of kept pulling me back to, okay, there's space for chaos. Let's just invite it in and see where it goes.
So we want to invite it in carefully.
Right.
Right. And intentionally. And with a sense of curiosity, which is kind of where we're going to this week. And I actually think this is a good time, unless someone has something they really want to say on synchronicity. There's some things that I wanted to share, but not quite yet. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to basically do one of the difficult writing prompts for this next week and just see how far we can get. If this prompt doesn't work, we're just going to free write on anything. Okay. This is a imaginative, we're going to flex our imagination. So the first prompt is just broad. Is imagination important, do you think? Or not so important? Do you think imagination is one of these things that is it important to you?
Is that the prompt?
That's part one.
Oh God.
Good. It sounds like we got something to write about there. Okay. I want you to imagine 3 different ways your life could go over the next 5 years. So you're going to imagine 3 different future lives. Life 1 is if things are basically just going to stay the same. So no big surprises. Nothing really changes. You just basically are going on how you would imagine it to go. What does that look like to you? Life 2, everything that you're doing now somehow stops. So people aren't having babies anymore. People aren't taking college classes anymore. People aren't, so whatever you're doing right now, that's not going to happen. Something else is going to happen. Again, this is an imaginative exercise. Life 3, what you would do if money, reputation, time had no bearing at all. So if I waved a wand and there was all of a sudden you didn't need to worry about rent, everything was taken care of, you could just do whatever you wanted. And you also didn't care what anybody thought of you. So I might do interpretive dance. I've been working on some stuff. It's called The Seed. No. So
John, could you repeat life 2 prompt?
Yes,
it cut out for me.
Yes, I was just going to do all 3. Life 2 is life. That's great. Life 2 is nothing. Everything changes. So what you're doing now, it's like the polar opposite of 1. Life 1 is everything basically stays the same. Life 2 is everything that you're doing somehow is no longer possible to do. So if you're a teacher, people stop going to school. If you're delivering babies, people stop delivering babies. People stop having babies. Whatever, that doesn't work. It's just, so there's everything that you're doing doesn't, and you can take that in any, yeah, maybe, I don't know if we want to go, it could be like, it could be just a more personal sense. So like, this might be like, if you imagine your future where you're going and you imagine the way that it's going, what would it look like if all those things were gone? What would you do? And this is kind of more like a practical one. Well, I might go back and work at the ice cream shop, right? The third option is all practicality off the table. So it doesn't matter. I'm gonna actually pursue my watercolor improvisational art dance piece. So we really have we have 2 prompts. One is, what do you think the imagination is important? And if so, why? The real prompt though is, use your imagination to imagine these 3 different routes your life could take. And if you want to, I had someone just be like, well, I just had so much fun with this exercise. I came up with like 10 different ones. Is that okay? I'm like, yeah, sure. If you want to come up with 8 lives and just write about each of them, like really briefly, or 2 lives and write about them in more depth. The point is that you're imagining future lives that you could lead. Another caveat, because I'm seeing Subarna's face. This is not supposed to be anxiety inducing. So this is just like, and someone else said that last time, it's like, oh my God, this is so stressful to imagine the paths my life could take. No, just try to remove that kind of pressure. You're just imagining. In Bill Burnett and Dave Evans, they use the example of moving to Costa Rica and starting a surf camp that's pirate themed for youth.
Nice.
So a pirate themed surf camp in Costa Rica. I love that example.
Yeah.
Awesome. Brad.
Hey.
Just in time. So the prompt is the value of the imagination. And then I want you to imagine 3 different paths your lives could take. One, if your life stays the same as it is, what will that look like in 5 years? 2, if what you're doing completely changes, what will that look like in 5 years? And 3, if money and reputation were of no matter, what would you do? And just put some skin on what those would be. What does that look like? And we're going to do this for about 15 minutes. Again, this shouldn't be anxiety provoking. And if you just want to write about imagination and have nothing to do with you, that's fine. Or if you want to just do like what's going on, what seems important now, that's fine as well. But we are going to do 15 minutes of free writing starting now. Good timing, Brad. Awesome. Here we go.
On each of those?
It's up to just anything. Yep.
Sorry, will you rattle those off one more time? I wasn't going to ask. Completely changes.
No, one is stays the same. What's going on in 5 years? 2, everything changes. So what you're relying on somehow goes away, or something is just completely different. What would that look like? But you're still providing for everybody as you are. 3, what would you do if money or reputation didn't matter at all?
Okay, thanks.
Yep. And we're still practicing free writing. So if something else comes up midway, like you're like, oh my God, I remember, you might want to go down memory lane in that way if you do it. We just have about 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes. Okay. Pens down. The test is over. No. There's great advice that if you get on something that you know you could write a lot more about, to either circle it or just make a note of it. I remember I used to almost just start putting those words on a different page because I just kind of looked at those ideas that were really inspiring. Because I hate to cut you off if you're in the middle of something. Okay, how was this for you? Hopefully it wasn't too anxiety provoking? Didn't it, on the process, can we go thumbs up, not so good, or terrible? Thumbs up. Why thumbs up? Whoops, I muted everybody too. Just so there's no noise while we wrote. So you'll need to unmute to talk.
I love that every time we have these massive questions, you start from like somewhere about where we are. So I feel like the first part of what is imagination and like writing down that belief sort of creates that ramp to slowly climb in to the introspection without much like judgment of self, because you've already established the belief, and then you can work around again last time's question of like who you are, what you believe, and what you do, to separate that I am necessarily not what I'm doing right now, but I can be what I believe. So that belief comes first, and that's not biased with who I am and what I do, and then there's a sense of okay, calm, okay, this is what I believe, and then we can play here and go there. That's it.
Awesome. Made me actually, I'll wait. I'm gonna wait on that. Other reactions?
I got stuck on the second prompt.
Me too.
Because I didn't quite, it was really hard for me as a mental construct to figure out what to think about that, because what is it that's ending? Is it just like, what? Is it like, is it that kind of the world ended and you're one of the 5 people left? Or is it just that my entire industry just obliterates itself?
More that one is how they're using this in the work sense, is that your way of subsisting that you've known it is just gone for some reason. What would you do?
The industry then. So kind of like everything, okay, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Or I mean,
so the internet dies. That would be the
best. That is a good one.
That's the one I was thinking. I'm like, okay, well, what is it? Is it is it like, all those shows we watch about the end of the world and the last for people, or is it like the internet's dead? So really seriously, that's a whole new life, right? Because the pandemic technically ended many of our lives in a certain way, right? But because of the internet, we're now we're still going because we have the internet.
Yeah, or no more money is like the third one.
So yeah. Uh,
I mean, it's interesting. I actually did think of someone in the first section who's a musician that I strong armed to take the first course. And he said, I can't think of anything else. Like, I literally cannot think of not making music. He's like, I can't think of that. I can't imagine that.
I suspect when your whole life is your main passion and your main like core expertise and your passion, you can't imagine that
Which,
not.
which is something really interesting about imagination, I think. So
But does the act of making music have anything to do with the music industry? So he can continue to be a musician or like make music, whether or not
It's
the
true.
industry exists.
yeah, that's why that's what he was saying. That's basically, he's like, I can't imagine a future where I'm not doing what I'm doing, at least in some way. I will always be like da 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 dee dee dee
Yeah.
dee dee. That's not what he does, thank God. But you get what I'm saying. Yeah. I mean, I feel like imagination is a portal to other ways of being. Like, it's a super powerful faculty that that's underdeveloped in our school system. It's seen as like imagination is over here, real life is over here. Where I don't know that those two things are actually that different from one another.
No. One of the reasons I was struggling with that second prompt is because I have kind of done both 2 and 3 without the money. I am living the life I want. I don't give a crap if anybody likes it or not, that I'm doing X instead of Y. I've given up all my experience of the last 15 years has been shelved, saying I'm doing this now. And kind of living to, in that sense, it's like I'm not going back to those other things. And that's just trying to figure out, what does that mean? Is it like 100 and I'm just last survivor on earth, or that kind of thing, or is it elsewhere? And yeah,
So I would think we're just playing. Yeah, we'll come back to that. We haven't heard from Monica or Chelsea very much.
I think I took this in a different direction. I
Great.
think I took it more personally.
Great.
So with imagination, I looked at imagination and how it affects my life, for the positive and for the negative, and how I build narratives about my life, and how a lot of those narratives are imagined. Like I said, I regret that my imagination has become so stale, and yet when I think about it, it's actually quite active. It's just repetitive and stalled, but it's still an imagination. It's creating a narrative about my life that may or may not be true. And then the second thing, if everything changes, nothing you have stays the same, or everything stays the same. I took that like in terms of my very practical life, my family, my house, my job, my everything. If that all stayed the same, do I like my life? And then, and if I suddenly lost everything, my husband, my child, oh, God forbid, I can't even think about it, but my job, like, like, would I be able to survive? Like, almost like, I took it there. What if everything that matters to me is just suddenly gone? That's where I went with it.
I love that you noticed. Chelsea, you go.
Oh no, you go. I'll go after you.
Just that the power of imagination to spin narratives, your just point that maybe you're using your imagination all the time, you're just using it in the same way to help you explain what's going on or tell the stories, that is kind of an imaginative faculty. Like, I imagine that this is what's happening, this is the story I'm telling that's happening, and that those stories can actually be conducive of more pain or conducive of more pleasure. So I can imagine, interestingly, I can imagine that I'm a pretty good person, or I can imagine that I'm kind of a shithead. Which one of those is true? I can tell you I'm actually a pretty good person. But you know what I mean? Like, it gets a little, maybe that's like a weird one. Or I can imagine I'm doing a really good job and I'm doing my best. or I can imagine that I'm not. And part of these, and I think we can get addicted to these narratives, and because we tell them so much that they then disappear. And now we're living underneath these narratives. Super great insight. So part of what we're doing potentially is again, coming back to where we've always been, but just looking at it a little differently. Yeah, it's really powerful. And the other thing this is a good place to say this now. I framed it in the context of work. Imagine the way you live is gone. I mean, the way you get your money is gone. And then now imagine what you'd do if money wasn't a thing, because that's what they do in the book. But I think a really powerful, what we're going to do at the end of the course, and if you just imagine ways of being, it's like, imagine the future most powerful version of you. I said this in the last cohort in Simi, and it was like, oh, I do this all the time. She's the glory version of myself. And I'm like, glory version? She's like, yeah. I ask the glory version of myself for advice all the time. And I'm like, what? She's like, yeah, I just have, it's like me, but just the most glorious version of me. And I'm like, holy shit, that's kind of what I'm talking about. So we have like glorious Simi, and Dan was in the class, and he's like, yeah, that makes sense. And I'm like, oh, is it dazzling Daniel and super Sean? And so I like kind of come up with alliterative like names for our like, whatever you can. Point being, if we see imagination as a way to like potentially inhabit different ways of being, and we then imagine ourselves instead of like these three different life paths, I'm going to imagine myself as super accepting and loving. I'm going to imagine someone that breathes really well and has good posture too, because that's what I've been working on. Oh, wow. Okay. It's easier for me to be that person because I can imagine what it's like, which has nothing to do with like how I'm making my bread, right? And in our culture and in the book, it's a lot about our income. But I almost think what you said, Monica, really made me want to make this point that maybe what we do for income is like actually completely beside the point. Like you said, Sabarna, what we do and who we are is not this. Like, I can be a person that cleans toilets and have that not reflect on me at all. It's just what I'm doing 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day. It's still not who I am. So there's a really interesting play here. So if you want to do, I should say another one is, who are you in these lifetimes? So what kind of a person are you? If you imagine, and this is worth getting this in the notes because imagine the most powerful version of yourself. And I hate to use the word powerful because that's my word. Imagine the most best
favorite version, like our favorite version of ourselves.
Favorite, sure. What kinds of qualities do you imagine in that? And I could also ask like a superhero version of yourself. If you're at your peak, what kinds of things, not what are you doing for money, who are you? Yeah, let's just do a minute and a half on that one. Awesome. Okay. That's 2 minutes. This is one I hate to interrupt. I hate interrupt people imagining the best versions of themselves. It's a terrible thing, but we're going to anyway. Because I want to hear about it. I did loving and laughing, and then I like laughed at myself. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to write a freaking Hallmark card of the best version of myself. Oh, Sean is just living, laughing, and loving. That's what Sean is. I'm going to put it on my fridge. So I kind of poked fun at myself. Does anybody want to share their just 3 or 4 words, the strongest version of themselves, and we will do our best to see that strongest version? I went loving and laughing are going to be my 2, and wonder and curiosity.
Got learner. I am a learner. I'm a listener. I'm a feeler. I'm a builder.
Love it. Great. Feeler builder. Strong. Authentic, courageous, and generative. Very strong.
There's also that saying that like you're in the ring or like you're in the arena and you're engaged with life, and there's like a fight to it that I'm imagining.
Scrappy.
Yeah.
But also not scrappy, but like you're engaged in what matters. You're engaged in the fight that matters. And you're which is why I like the Designing Your Life book when they're like, you can't make decisions in the abstract. You can't figure this out in the abstract. You have to go build and make stuff. Because we just can't figure out our life in the abstract. We have to do it in practice. Ooh, Chelsea's is beautiful. Aww. So I feel so cared for even just reading that.
Chelsea, did you just say something, but I couldn't hear you?
I typed it.
Oh,
It's in the chat of being maternal and childlike.
I thought I saw her lips moving, but no sound.
I keep going back to Lee's share on the energy exchange, where how you spend energy energizes you. And I think though that was the definition for work, I think that's a pretty good way of looking at life, is how you're spending energy. Does it energize you back or not?
Okay. Does anybody else want to share anything about about what they wrote or different life designs?
I just thought. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Chelsea, then Brad.
I just going back to that, the imagination and it being important. I went really specific like you, Monica, and it was a little too much. I guess that was maybe for the second prompt, like losing my child or my job and things like this. But then I just like backed off a little and thought of imagination being like just the fingerprint of the mind, and that it's kind of how we advance in humanity or any realm, science, art, parenting, whatever it is within yourself. And that's like I don't know, even just in this class, how we need to be, we're trying to be more deeply connected to our purpose, or that like kind of connecting to the imagination is what, like it goes hand in hand with our purpose. Like that's like our fingerprint, I guess. I keep going back to that metaphor. And so I think imagination is very important.
Fingerprint makes me think of contact. So there's touching. You don't have a fingerprint unless there's contact. Mm-hmm. But it also makes me think of authentic too. Like my imagination, my print is not going to be like another person's print. It's quite beautiful.
Thinking
Yeah.
of
I had that in there too. Like
sorry.
it's your unique gift. That's your imagination is your unique, authentic gift. Okay, sorry, Monica.
No, that's great.
Agreed.
I was talking about that. I was on the chat. I was telling how I finally listened to that Anne Lamott thing, and she was talking about how the critic was important in our early life because it kept us from killing ourselves, literally. Like,
Yeah. Driving off
okay,
a cliff or
so
something.
it just occurred to me, what if the imagination is our dry run? You know, like we're going through these scenarios. How many of you guys, like, when you're about to have a conversation with someone, like play it through in your head and like think of it, like, this is what I'm going to say. Okay, this is, what if they say this? And, you know, like our imagination is part of that safety net in a way of, it's almost, it's not the inner critic because it's not that mean, but it's our trial run of scenarios and possibilities so that we feel safe going into, I don't know. It's fledgling idea, but that's where I went with that. Yeah, good. Lulu, you
Algorithm.
say the best things. She
Whoa!
says the best
Boom!
things.
I
You do.
know. She
You
doesn't
really
even need
do.
to say it. I like the idea of a safety net, a trial run. I think, part of what makes us human is what I meant to say. Like that ability to think of different things and then adapt to those variety of scenarios as they happen. I was framing that as like just a giant gift. But Monica, your first share was like, actually, that can be pretty anxiety provoking as well. Like we have to be careful with how we use this gift, because then we can, yeah.
I think one of the things that came up, Monica, and what you said reminded me of it, is that the whole analogy of like free speech, where everybody wants free speech, but we may not like what we get to hear. So that conundrum of like, yes, you want to imagine, you want that childlike state, but the childlike state is also pretty scared at times and pretty free at times. And both can't exist without each other. You can't have absolute freedom without perception of fear. And maybe you can perceive fear without freedom. But yeah. And also because I was thinking about how the writing practice and the spiritual practice, whatever it may be, it's a lot more about receptivity, and that may be and that's universal. So that's not necessarily, but while we want it to be positive, it has its own like angels and demons scenario where, like free speech, we want to open the faucet, but we don't know what's going to come through. We expect that it'll be good, but we're more cautious. And I think that's also what keeps people from opening the tap in the first place, that they may not like what they see. But I guess it depends from person to person.
What keeps us from learning is that we oftentimes aren't nurtured enough to feel free to take those kinds of risks. We don't feel safe. If we don't feel safe to take those learning risks, we're not going to, which is why that support is so crucial. One of the things that I hope this class does. Brad, is what you wanted to say still relevant? I know we kind of passed over.
Not sure where we are. I'll keep listening.
I'm not sure where we are either. I love that response. That's kind of why I went to you. So I'm like, I don't know what's going on. Brad?
I can just share about I think one thing was sharing about our shares, and then also, we were talking about like creation, and I definitely, if we're just like riffing about like creation, that's what it makes me think of with imagination is, in some traditions, which I believe as well, is that things are created spiritually first before they are physically. And in order to be created spiritually, there's thought, there's an evolution of creation, and before it's created in its physical form, there's this imagination that you guys are all saying. So I was just relating to it.
It's kind of, what was that quote of beauty, that beauty is like making something immaterial material, like bringing something from that world of imagination into the world.
I keep on thinking about, like, in the tarot deck, there's the sword deck, sword suit, and then that's the mind and the imagination, I feel like, or where that the mind is where it can stem from, especially when it becomes like negative. I don't know. I just think like imagination and also the critic could be coming from the same place, and that it could be a double-edged sword, and we have to like use it with responsibility and awareness and yeah.
I think, sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, I'm kind of just wondering about if you guys have thoughts about the difference between imagination and the critic. Are they the same thing, or are they coming from the same place? Yeah.
I think imagination encompasses all of it. Like, I think it takes a lot of imagination to critique in a certain way, and not like just dissing something critic, like I don't like that, and it's not quite like that, but looking at it subjectively and saying in relation to, etc. That's what I feel. And then, but imagination is also this other practice of imagining what could be in a way that it talks about, as well as practicing. I feel like I've been practicing this life I want for the last year. But yeah, I find that good critique needs imagination.
Are they sisters, and one is constructive and one is destructive?
And do we have multiple?
I wanted to this is reminding me of a book I picked up, I think, last week, because I realized that a lot of it also has to do with the whole masculine and feminine, and maybe that doesn't relate to everybody else. But I picked up this book called Women Who Run with the Wolves, and it's about the divine feminine. And I've been riffing off it. And what this reminds me of is that, do animals imagine? And if they do imagine, do they judge themselves based on that imagination? And that sort of reminds me of the whole like critique and that sphere of things. And it said like wild nature in terms of has like vast integrity to it, and how it's to be able to like to be in one's body with certainty and pride, regardless of the body's gifts and limitations. And I felt like that was so powerful, because we are animals, and I get that our levels of construct and our ability to think is sort of built on top of that. But if we were to take all of that away, I feel like animals probably don't critique themselves as much, but they probably would imagine. Because I don't know the scientific working behind it, but it's just an interesting concept to think that if you were in wilderness and there was nobody judging you, and it was just your pack, but you didn't really communicate, because I feel like that's where a lot of our sensor is also like fed from, is the act of like literal communication. But just to think about the wild nature of being, the divine feminine, and that feeds into what somebody just said about the two sisters, and how like in one of the stories, because this book is based on like stories, and then they have explanations around that, and like stories from different cultures. And she does say like how this La Loba, this divine femininity, exists for like both darkness and creation. So it's like even with the cycles of life and the cycles of seeds, and whether, okay, I'm just going to stop, but I think that was good. It just sort of synchronizes together into the conversation really well to what I had been brewing inside.
David Abrams is awesome.
My mom just gave me the Becoming Animal Towards an Earthly Cosmology. And it's basically about re-entering seeing our mind as as part of the earth. That we have this from Cartesian dualism and Plato, we think our mind and our ideas are somehow separate from the earth, and that really isn't really what's going on. So that we are, and that made me think of also a lot of our imagination and our goals are culturally conditioned. So I imagine myself on like, I don't know, on vacation, and it's like, really though? Is that you imagining that? Is that your body, the animal, imagining that? Or is that like the TV show that you watched and all the TV shows that you watched? You know what I mean? And I feel for kids on social media now. I feel for myself on social media now for that reason.
It's also what's projected, right? Like going
Right.
on, like it's absolutely is like there's some kids I know who are like they want to play about going on vacation and they only want to play like that's the extent of the imagination for some reason at at this point, because they also see this like what their parents and others are saying is like fun things to do, going on vacation, going to a restaurant, like that seems to be some kids, but also we do, right? Like everyone's like we need to go travel the world. Like when I moved back to North America after being around the world for a while, um, all across social media, I would keep seeing people talking about, I traveled to this many countries and I traveled here this year and I traveled that year. It seemed to be a cultural fad to be traveling now in the last 10 years. Like traveling is this thing. And even on dating profiles, people are like, I traveled this. And then, so it's like this marker of success or just it becomes who you are, right? But
Yeah, so part of what I do want to work to somewhat disentangle that in our own conceptions of the good life, at least to be aware of that and see if we might have a good life for us might actually be more basic than those things. I also put the thing in there about imagining what it's like to be different animals as a source of power. So if you imagine literally that you're a hawk and that gives you power to imagine you're a hawk, then that might be a connection that you have with that. But I want to, because we're starting to round towards the end here. We can use, so basically what we want to do, what we're working on, imagination is the first step. And then what we're going to do this week is begin exploring with how we can put it in action. So the question is, how can we use our imagination to act in new ways and learn more about what we're imagining? So we're looking at Burnett and Evans, and they have this basically, what we just did are the beginnings of 3 Odyssey plans. Do we know Homer's Odyssey? He like goes on some grand adventure and then comes back. It's what all people should do before they go to college. It's a side note. We're doing that. They encourage you to develop 3 different Odyssey plans, and then you test them. So I want to be an interpretive dancer that uses watercolor backdrops to put the human story of birth and rebirth to movement. And I need I want a beatbox like behind me. So I'm like, I need to get the music. I need to start doing this. What's going to look like? Whatever. I am not in a position to know what it's like to be an interpretive dancer, but I know some people that do interpretive dance. I could reach out to them and learn what it's like to be that, to better imagine it. Here's another example. When I was growing up in my 20s, I wanted to be in a rock band. I wanted to be a professional musician. When I got to my mid-30s and we started to have some success, I realized that being a professional musician in America from a day-to-day point is a lot like middle management. It's project management. It's very unsexy. And you're dealing with people with drug problems. It's a pain in the ass is what it is. I no longer want to be a professional musician. And how many professional musicians did I talk to hear what it's like? The couple were like, are you sure you want this, kid? And I'm like, yeah. No, you're not. Because I never tested my imagination. I was just like, oh, I think I would just do this. It'll be great. I had no idea. One of the reasons why Burnett and Evans are so brilliant is that they have us test, basically put into the world what these might be to begin to see. Now, let's use Pirate Surf Camp in the Caribbean. That's going to be pretty hard to test or expensive to test. So how might you approximate that experience? Maybe you could volunteer. If it's a surf camp for kids, you could volunteer with kids. If you know other people that run surf camps, you can talk to them. So they basically have 2 types of tests we can run. This is Sabarna said this earlier. Conversations is one of them. Fascinating. I love that play. and then experiences are the other. They call both of these prototypes. And this is the design thinking, design thinking, bias to action is what they call it. Let's say I want to be an interpretive dancer. I don't need to have my interpretive dance make me money. I'm just going to put one of my interpretive dances online and see what people's reactions are. I'm just going to try something for a set amount of time and use it to learn. So the work this week is we're moving from synchronicity to design. Synchronicity, serendipity to design. Lu Yi reached out to me about grad school or not grad school after the alumni meeting. And we were like, well, what would that be like? And I'm trying to figure out whether or not to go to grad school or how I even think about that decision. I'm like, that's a cool, you're talking to the right person because I love this question. Let's go there. Right? I am one person. Lu Yi, if you talk to somebody else about that, they would give you a different answer. And that's the fun of it. So now you're looking at the grad school you like, and you find the person that's doing this cool thing in this cool program, and you're like, you look like a cool person. This looks like a cool program. Should I come to this grad school? 15 minutes. So they basically say there's two things that you're basically, when you reach out to someone, you're saying to have a prototype conversation. Basically say two things. I'm lost and you might be able to help. Or like, I'm curious about your perspective. I'm curious what you see from where you are. People love to talk about themselves. And people love to share what they know about their experience. So this is in the center of this curriculum design for a reason. Because there's like the heart of this is us designing certain kinds of experiences that we can have that teach us more about what we could do and where we could go. This is also the key to find good work. It's through the back door. The more of these are also called information interviews. And we're going to do, as we move forward, another word for these, another way of looking at these is appreciative inquiry. So you're just inquiring with people to find what you can appreciate about them, which is really helpful for people that are frustrating and challenging to do that. Okay, but each of these modes are kind of prototypes to test various paths you could go on. So if you're in the camp of people that are in transition, or I know if you're thinking about having this creative project, you can reach out to mentors that might be able to help you along in that path, or just ask them. I'm actually thinking of you, Chelsea, from what you talked about before the class even started with that person. They see you doing this creative artwork, right? I would reach out to them and be like, what should I be doing every day? If I was going to work on this for 20 minutes a day, what should I be doing? If I am a professional established artist doing what they're doing, I would love to tell you what to do for 20 minutes every day. Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Let me tell you. Now all of a sudden, you have a relationship with somebody. Well, you already did. Okay, so there's a couple things this asks for. One, a certain amount of courage. You gotta like be willing to act. Two, a certain amount of flexibility, which is what you're just trying shit. You're not trying to get it right. You're just exploring. Like no pressure. I came up in mind, the other interesting thing for me that is a good time to mention this, I've done this exercise since I've been a student in this class every time I've taken it. This is the 5th time, and this is the 5th month. It's changed a little bit each time. What does that tell you? We're not playing for keeps here. Shit's gonna change again 7 weeks from now. Back to exploring without exploiting, and also non-attachment to particular outcomes. Did you hear about the Buddhist vacuum cleaner? No attachments. It's terrible. If you start getting attached to like, ooh, I really want to run a successful company. Oh, I really want more people to sign up for my class. Ooh, I really want this to launch by fall of 2021. You start introducing anxiety, judgment, stress. And let's be honest, none of us have any fucking idea what's going on. Sorry. I just saw a Feynman quote that was like, no one ever figures out life. Just do something you love and see where it takes you. I love Feynman. Okay. Does this seem like this tracks? Like, does this, the other thing is that it's natural for me, one, if you want to do the work this week, to not necessarily know, but you might have, like, when I was doing my pages, I was like, holy shit, reach out to Sarah Beth, that hybrid professional, because I want to ask her about hybrid professional identities on Clubhouse. So I just had like a glint of a direction that I was going to go for my own personal interest. But we are building on the synchronicity week, because it's not, your prototype experiments and conversations are not going to be like, maybe they are, maybe you have like a lead like I do, but you maybe don't. Like, I have no idea how to test this. Ask that in your pages. Stay open to like oh, this is interesting. Wow, I just noticed that the Harvard Business Leaders Club is on. Crazy. Was one of my synchronicities. Francis Frey's Harvard Business Leadership Club on Clubhouse. Fucking awesome. They just did a whole book on humor, seriously, and how important humor is and why it feels so good, which Anne Lamott talks about humor as carbonated holiness. So I'm like, this is the shit. That spoke to me. That was synchronistically. So maybe one of my lives is to be a comedian, facilitator comedian. Didn't think of that. But that would definitely be like a completely different thing. And now I'm thinking differently about what I'm doing now because of that imagination. I'm also getting a sense of greater freedom. And the other great thing, like the TikTok video that I made that went viral, was me saying the average American will have 7 to 8 careers in their lifetime. If you're getting hung up on what you should do with your life, remember that you're going to have an opportunity to do multiple things. And then you're going to retire if you're lucky and have free time to do something else. So maybe that's when you teach college or like do your interpretive dance finally. So this week is on designing, and how we design a life is through these little micro experiments. It's like a 15-minute conversation. And there's also a sense in this week, there's a sense, and last week, a sense of play and just playing around with stuff. It's that quote, people will waste 30 years of their life because they're not willing to waste 30 minutes. Have the 30-minute conversation with someone. Reach out, initiate a few conversations. If you want like legit concrete homework by the next time we meet, I think the best thing to do to just get the most out of this class is to try to have 3 different conversations with people that you can ask questions for and 1 experience. Experiences are harder to set up than conversations. But if you can do something that gives you a taste of something, and then you can talk with 3 different people, then you're putting your imagination into the world and then getting feedback and adjusting and doing it again. And that's how you really, like, that's the power of learning. That's what I cannot understand why we don't teach people this in college. You can learn anything. You just need to find the people to learn from and the experiences to do it with.
Not sure. Thanks.
Brad, please. No, I'm just saying, put a time box on it. So you're like, see how much I can do in this amount of time and move on. Kill it. Learn from it. Repeat. Go ahead, Brad. I've been going long enough.
I love how that time box can just be like 20 minutes, like you suggested.
Yes.
Or, you know, it's like not a huge thing. I just wanted to share. I don't know. I kind of cheated with the homework. I've already gotten started in a lucky way. I have an appointment with a doctor. He's a doctor on Clubhouse. And I'm going to ask these questions. You know, like, I'm lost. I'm curious about what you see from where you are. You know, I want to get into the spiritual mental wellness sort of zone. Yes. You know, here's what I have, and you know, what's up. And I love that aspect rather than like yeah, it just gives me some framework to use. So that's really cool. And then what's the other one? Oh, and then would this be a good one for my experience? I'm gonna create a clubhouse room with the title of something like listen to music for 7 minutes, write your lyrics, and then sing me your song
Nice.
and feel your superpower. Would that be an experiential one?
Fuck yeah.
Okay.
I'm glad if you can have a question that goes along with it. You're curious about one, whether or not this will work. You're curious how people respond to it. You're curious how you feel about it, or you're just curious to see how it goes. So you can bake questions into your experience. Is this too long? Is this too short? You don't need to do that, but you can it's basically like hypothesis testing.
Yeah. It kind of gives me a starting point which to like
Correct.
work from. Like, is 7 minutes a good time to write a lyric?
Correct. Other good questions, like for that conversation with your doctor, is what kinds of things might I do to give me a taste of what you do? Or what other people might I talk to that might be able to help me out? Or what other resources do you have for me? Like, I really appreciate this, and I'm most interested in you saying this. What other resources, like, or other people might help me figure this out? What are some good first steps I could take if I wanted to go a little further on this? The other one, you know that meme of like what people think I do, what my parents think I do, what I actually do. And like what I actually do is like not really intuitive. It's like my example. What I actually do as a musician is like project manage drug addicts. You can ask them that question. Like, what is it, on a day to day, I'm thinking about doing this career. What is it that you do on a day to day basis that's not like, what do you, and I also personally, I like to ask people, what do you love about what you do? Just right off the bat. So they start talking about like, why do you love this? You built a career around public speaking. Why did you do that? What do you love about this? Oh, I just love that feeling of like, that moment when everything comes together. It's like, okay, well, there you go. That make sense? Okay, secondly, last reminder, I'm going to send the email again as we go, but in the Google folder, I put all the modules up for the rest of the course because it is going to start. We're going to transition from design to people. I do think people are the huge part of the good life. In fact, that the longest study on human flourishing started with happiness is love, full stop, period, which is a weird way to start an academic paper, but that's what they did because the findings are pretty unequivocal. Our ability to relate to other people and keep those relationships going is a huge part. There's other studies about the soft ties. So like what we're doing right now, feeling connected with people, not in like a really intimate way, but a connection that comes up again. Like we see the cobbler every 6 months and the cobbler goes, "Oh, how are your shoes?" And we go, "They're pretty good. Thanks, cobbler." Those are indications of well-being. People that have those weak ties live longer, feel better. So we're moving into the final unit of the courses on people, and still in the middle, we're in design and thinking. And as we go forward, I just put all that stuff in there. So we're on week 4, and we're going to do 2 more on people and 1 on reflection. But if you want to see that to kind of cheat to see where we're going, that might be helpful just to skim it. And otherwise, we're kind of playing with different kinds of experiences we could have with ourselves and with the world we live in, which is why this really ties into the synchronicity week. So if you played with synchronicity or you want to play more with it, I didn't do it on a day-to-day basis as much as I did in the past. But when I looked back over the week on everything that happened, I was like, holy shit, there's some interesting things that happened this week. Personally. And I know we didn't talk about that very much. Okay, reach out to me if you need anything. And I appreciate you all. That was fun. Sabarna, thanks. And Luyi, thanks. Everybody, really. But bye, Monica. Bye, Brad. Thanks. Chelsea, feel free to reach out if you want to chat.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
See everybody.
See ya. Bye, Chelsea.
Bye, Sean. Thank you.
See you.